Hi everyone, this is Sapna Goel. I am an assistant professor in the economics department at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. So today let's talk about the idea of women's work. Women's work in, let's say, the entire spectrum of unpaid household activities, which is this cooking, cleaning, childcare activities, and also women's participation in the economic activities sphere, that is the production sphere. So I think it would be very interesting to see how the participation of men and women has changed, let's say, in last 20 years or so in these two different spheres. So it's an interesting period because you see the first 2 decades of the present century, if you look at the mid 2000s, that has been a period of impressive economic growth rates. Indian economy almost reached double digit growth, and also, let's say, we also so fertility rates declined across most of the states, and the gender gap in education also came down. So several kind of positive developments were there. And then in the next decade we saw COVID-19, which was one of the major health and economic crisis. So while all those changes were happening, what sort of changes do we see in the way men and women are spending their time in various activities? So that's something that we are going to talk about. But before that, we are also going to try to understand various concepts. For example, let's say you must have heard about this, that female labor force participation rate in case of India is very low compared to even some of the South Asian countries, and also the participation rate for women in India has been continuously declining starting from, let's say, mid 2000. From 2017-18 we do see some increase in the participation rate, but the first question that comes up here is that how do we even define the concept of participation, labor force participation? How are we even defining it? So I'm sure that most of you do understand the basic idea of labor force, which is simply that people who are actually working, or let's say people who are actively looking for work. But we'll refine this definition a bit more in this video so that we are also able to look at some of the recent trends, some of the numbers. Okay, so this is the idea that first we'll go through some of the concepts, then we'll look at some of the numbers related to women's participation, and then we'll go through some of the trends and how those trends, how we can make sense of those trends with certain theoretical or philosophical viewpoints as well. So first let's look at some slides to understand the basic definitions and some of the basic numbers. Let's see through the slides. Okay, so to understand the concept of participation, first we need to understand, let's say, how can we divide all the different activities? What is the broad classification that we have? So we can take up this classification here, economic activities and non-economic activities. So economic activities, as you can understand, so all the market-oriented activities will basically be economic activities. In addition to the market-oriented activities, we also have some of the non-market activities which can be considered as economic activities. So primarily you have subsistence agriculture that figures in this, and then you also have, let's say, on account production of fixed assets, construction of your own houses, roads, etc. So these activities which are non-market activities, that is not for pay or profit, but these activities are still considered as economic activities. Now why we are talking about these activities here is, our main idea here is to understand if if any individual is basically part of the labor force or not. So for that, first we needed to go through this idea that how do we define economic activities. Okay, so next question comes up, being in the labor force or not being in the labor force. So as we discussed in the beginning also, if somebody is engaged in any economic activity which we just defined, or if she is actually looking for some work, then this person is considered as being in the labor force, otherwise not being in the labor force. But you need a time cutoff here. So if you go by the NSS employment unemployment service, if you use their definition, this is one of the key data source that we have in India to understand employment related numbers, labor force related numbers, etc., across several dimensions, across caste, religion and gender, etc. So going by NSS employment unemployment survey definitions, we can have three different kind of reference period. We can take a reference period of 365 days, 7 days or 1 day. So then let's see what is the time criteria, time cutoff for these three different reference periods. For 365 days, the idea is, let's say, if somebody is working or looking for work for majority of the year, then she will be considered as being in the labor force. And for 7 days, if the reference period is 7 days, then if somebody is working or actively looking for work for at least 1 hour on at least 1 day, then this person will be considered as being in the labor force. Again, where are they working? It has to be in one of the economic activities, any of the economic activity that we talked about before. And then if you take, let's say, the reference period of 1 day, in that case this person will be considered as being in the labor force if he she actually worked for at least 1 hour or actively were looking for work for at least 1 hour but did not do the work. Okay, so these are the definitions that you can use to understand labor force going by the NSS employment unemployment surveys. Okay, and then the basic calculation of labor force participation is people who are employed plus number of unemployed persons divided by the total population into 100. So number of employed persons meaning people who are actually working, number of unemployed persons meaning people who are looking for work but they are not able to find any work. Okay, so this is the idea of labor force. Now that you are clear with labor force participation rate, the idea of labor force, let's look at some of the numbers here which are very interesting. Okay, so in this graph, what do we see? So first, let me make this clear where I have taken this data from. This is from the various rounds of NSS employment unemployment surveys and also periodic labor force survey. Now note this, that NSS employment unemployment surveys are available with a gap of 5 years. So every 5 years we have this available, but from 2017-18 we actually have annual periodic labor force survey. So now we have all this information available each year from 2017-18. So using these data sets, I have looked into female labor force participation rate, the way we have defined this in the last slide. Okay, this is for all age groups. But do we see here, you can clearly see the trend that from 2004-5, between 2004-5 to 2017-18, female labor force participation rate has been continuously declining, and from 2017-18, the labor force participation rate has started to increase. Now this is interesting because you see, I talked about in the beginning also that mid 2000 was this period when Indian economy did reach almost double digit growth and several other positive developments were there, but still the participation rate has been continuously declining. But recently there has been a reversal of this trend. So we'll go through what is the logic why we see a continuous decline and then this recent reversal of trend. We'll try to understand these trends in another video, but for now let's look at the case of rural India also. So you see similar trend in rural India. The female labor force participation rate has been continuously declining from 33% to 18% in 2017-18, more than 10 percentage point decline. And then you see that the participation rate has almost doubled between 2017-18 to 23-24, which is also very interesting. That how do we understand this recent reversal of trend? Is it like opportunity driven or is it distress driven? That's something that we'll take up in another video. Another bit is urban India. So what do we see here? Between 2004-5, 17-18, more or less the participation rate has stayed the same, but the increase actually has happened in case of urban India also between 2017-18 to 23-24. So about 7 percentage point increase is what we see in case of urban India. Okay, so we did look at some of the numbers and we talked about some of the definitions as well. And in the next video, we'll try to make a sense of that why the female labor force participation rate was continuously declining from mid 2000s, and also what is this reversal of trend that we see in the recent years. Is it opportunity driven or is it just distress driven? So that's something we'll talk about in the next video. But also something else that we need to be really careful about when we are talking about women's work is this, that the way NSS employment unemployment survey captures women's work, it is seriously underestimated. Women's actual participation in the economic sphere also is much more compared to what the NSS numbers are telling us. So there are several methodological and definitional issues in the way NSS captures women's work. So we'll talk about those issues as well, and we'll see how some of those issues have been taken care of from a different data set that we have now, which is the time use survey, in which basically we record how men and women are spending their time in a given day in various activities. But we'll talk about this in the next video. But for now, I think this is it. Thank you for watching.